had been planning the trip for months. I wanted a real escape from the city, from the constant noise and the endless demands of work and people. I wanted silence, isolation, and the raw experience of being alone in the wilderness. I packed carefully, making lists, checking them twice. Tent, sleeping bag, extra blankets, water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, headlamp, extra batteries, maps, compass, knife, matches, stove, fuel, a small axe, rope, tarp, whistle, and even some heavy-duty gloves. I wasn't taking chances. This was my first solo camping trip, and I wanted it to be perfect. I had chosen a remote forest in the mountains, far from any towns or trails. It looked on the map like a dense green patch surrounded by ridges and small rivers. The roads stopped long before the forest started. From then on, it would be foot travel only. The drive up was long and uneventful. As the asphalt turned to dirt, the trees thickened. The air became cooler, fresher. There was a smell of wet earth, moss, and pine. Birds called out occasionally, their sounds echoing through the canyon-like valleys between ridges. I parked my car near the last accessible point and started walking with my pack, feeling the weight but also feeling alive. The sun was high, and the sky was clear blue. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than a faint dirt track, overgrown with grass and small bushes. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I made my way deeper. By the time I found a spot that felt right for setting up camp, the sun was dipping behind the mountains. I had chosen a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was flat enough, firm, and not too close to the river that ran nearby. I set up my tent, careful to stake it securely. I laid down a tarp first to protect the bottom from moisture. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, unrolled my foam pad, and checked my supplies one more time. Then I built a fire. It wasn't easy. The wood was damp in places, and the wind had begun to pick up as the sun sank. I struggled with tinder, using dry bits of pine bark and some small twigs. Eventually, the fire caught. I fed it slowly, keeping it small but steady. Firelight flickered against the trees, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was crisp and cold now, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the day. I ate a simple meal, mostly canned beans, some jerky, and water. I had saved the heavier food for the following days. Night came quickly. The forest sounds changed. Birds were silent, replaced by the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. Somewhere in the distance, an animal barked or howled. I wasn't sure what it was. I tried to relax, reminding myself that animals were usually more afraid of me than I was of them. I checked my knife, made sure my flashlight was working, and went to bed early, hoping to start fresh at dawn. The night was uneasy. The wind grew stronger, shaking branches and making the tent flap. Every small noise sounded magnified. I imagined animals moving through the underbrush. At some point, a sharp snap of wood somewhere not too far from my tent made my heart race. I lay still, listening. There was nothing after a minute, but the echo of that noise stayed in my mind. I eventually fell asleep, though the sleep was shallow and punctuated by sudden wakes at every rustle. Morning was quiet but chilly. The sun barely reached my clearing, the shadows from the pines stretching long across the ground. I had planned to hike along the river today, maybe follow it upstream and see if I could find a better, more open area for another night. I packed lightly, leaving the tent standing, and took only essentials: water, a small snack, my knife, and my first aid kit. I moved carefully, trying not to disturb the forest more than necessary. The river was low, winding in and out of dense vegetation. The air smelled damp and earthy. I noticed tracks along the mud near the bank. Small, probably deer, and larger ones too, maybe a bear or a wild boar. I stayed alert. As the day passed, I realized how disorienting the forest could be. The trees, although varied, all seemed similar at a glance. Rocks, roots, fallen logs, streams. Patterns repeated endlessly. I had a compass, I had a map, but without a clear trail, it was easy to get turned around. I marked my path with small, discrete indicators, stacked stones, broken branches, so I could find my way back. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered, and the wind grew sharper. The forest felt different now, more oppressive, almost suffocating in its density. I decided to head back to my clearing. On the way, I stepped on loose rocks and twisted my ankle slightly. Pain shot up my leg. I cursed silently, examined it, and managed to hobble along. I wrapped it with part of my bandage and took a short break to rest. The clouds were darker now, and the wind carried a damp chill. I could hear the river, but everything else was muted, muffled by the thickness of the forest and the sound of the wind. By the time I returned to my camp, the sun had disappeared entirely. Dusk was settling, leaving a dim gray light that made the forest look almost black in places. I started the fire again, though finding dry wood was harder than before. The wind was picking up more. I built a small lean-to using my tarp and some rope, hoping it would shield me from any rain or falling debris. I prepared dinner, heated some kin soup, and tried to stay calm. I noticed that the forest seemed alive in a different way. The rustle of animals moving through the underbrush was constant. Sometimes, I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the firelight. My heart raced at every crack of wood or snapping twig. Night fell fully. I tried to sleep again, but the wind howled, and the trees groaned. The fire struggled against gusts. I noticed that some branches had broken and fallen nearby. The forest felt closer, almost pressing in around me. Every movement in the darkness seemed amplified. Then I heard something different. A low, repeated thumping, like heavy footsteps moving slowly through the trees. Not a single footstep, but a pattern, deliberate. My heart pounded. I kept quiet, straining to hear, trying to tell myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear moving through fallen logs. The noise stopped suddenly, and then after a minute, resumed farther away. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness. Nothing, only shifting shadows, rustling leaves. I considered going to investigate, but the thought of venturing into total darkness alone was terrifying. I stayed in my tent, flashlight in hand, listening. The thumping moved gradually closer, and then paused, like whatever it was assessing me. Hours passed in agonizing tension. I didn't dare sleep. I could hear smaller animals moving, but the large thumps were gone now. I wondered if I had imagined them, but the marks on the ground near the perimeter of my camp told a different story. Heavy footprints, not human, staggered near the edge of the clearing, pressed into the soft soil. I examined them by flashlight. They were large, with wide toes and deep impressions. I had never seen anything like them before. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I had to be careful, make no sudden movements, keep my fire small but alive, keep my knife close. By morning, exhaustion hit me like a wave. I had barely slept, and my muscles ached from tension and the twisted ankle. I decided I had to move. Staying in that clearing was dangerous, especially if a large animal had been lurking so close. I packed quickly, checking the tent for anything left behind. I wrapped my ankle tighter, making sure it was supported. I planned to follow the river back downstream, hoping it would lead to a better path and possibly even the road. The walk was slow. My ankle throbbed with every step. The forest felt denser, almost claustrophobic. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. At one point, I slipped on a wet rock and fell into the shallow river, soaking myself. The cold water burned, but I got up and kept moving. Hours passed, the sun barely breaking through the thick canopy. I began to see signs of human activity. An old campsite, a makeshift fire pit, some rusted tin cans. Relief and caution mixed in equal measure. Someone had been here before me, maybe hunters, maybe other campers. The trail of human traces gave me hope that I could find my way out. As evening approached, I finally saw a faint dirt track leading away from the forest toward the mountains. I followed it cautiously, every sound amplified, my eyes scanning for movement. I crossed the river carefully, using fallen logs as bridges, and slowly the terrain began to open up. The trees thinned, giving way to a wider valley. The sun was low now, but I could see in the distance the shape of a small road, the asphalt glinting in the remaining light. Relief hit me like nothing else. I increased my pace, hobbling but determined. I finally reached the road, exhausted, bleeding in small scratches from branches, wet, dirty, and utterly spent. I rested at the roadside, catching my breath, scanning for any vehicles. Soon, a truck appeared, kicking up dust. I waved frantically, my heart hammering. The truck slowed, then stopped. The driver helped me into the vehicle, offered blankets and water. I explained briefly where I had been, and they nodded, taking me to the nearest town and calling emergency services to report the incident. I never went back to that forest. Even though I had survived, even though I had been careful and prepared, the memory stayed with me. The oppressive silence, the dark movements just beyond the firelight, the giant footprints near my camp, the thumping that came so close it felt deliberate. I realized that nature can be unforgiving, that isolation magnifies fear, that the wilderness is not a place for arrogance or carelessness. But I also learned that preparation, vigilance, and calm under pressure can save your life. I had survived because I stayed aware, because I respected the environment and its dangers, and because I never allowed panic to take control. The forest had challenged me, had frightened me in ways I could never have imagined, but I had walked out alive. Even months later, I could remember every detail. The feel of wet leaves underfoot, the smell of damp earth, the cold bite of the river, the endless shadowed shapes of the forest, and the moments when I thought I might not make it. But I also remembered the sun breaking through the trees at the edge of the valley, the sight of the road ahead, and the overwhelming relief of knowing I had survived. That clarity, that sense of accomplishment, stayed with me far longer than the fear, a reminder that even in the most frightening circumstances, careful planning, awareness, and persistence can see you through. I had been planning this trip for months, carefully choosing the remote section of the forest where I could be completely alone. I wanted a break from the city, from the noise and the pressure of work, from the endless screens and the constant flow of people. I had my map, my compass, my backpack packed with essentials, and I thought I knew what I was doing. I had camped before, of course, but never this far in, where no one would be able to hear a shout if something went wrong. I told myself that solitude was what I needed, that the quiet of nature would calm my mind. I was wrong, but I wouldn't realize it until I was deep in the woods, with the darkness pressing in on me like a living thing. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, and the sunlight filtered through the tall pines in long golden streaks. The forest smelled of damp earth and pine needles, with a faint hint of decaying leaves from the previous autumn. I hoisted my pack, heavier than I had remembered from my calculations, and started down the narrow path that wound into the woods. First, it was peaceful. Birds called to each other, and somewhere in the distance, a stream whispered over rocks. I followed the trail, noting landmarks, crossing small brooks on slippery stones, and feeling a thrill of satisfaction at being completely alone in a place where few ventured. As the morning turned into afternoon, the trail became rougher. The path was overgrown in places, the underbrush scratching at my legs through my long pants, and roots twisted underfoot, making the ground treacherous. I had chosen a spot for camping near a small clearing that I had marked on the map. It was about 10 miles in, a place where the trees thinned and I could find dry ground for my tent. I felt confident, even as a sense of isolation settled over me like a weight. This was part of the experience, I told myself. Feeling small in a vast forest was natural. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was smaller than I had hoped, surrounded on 3 sides by dense pines, with a rocky ridge to the west. The ground was uneven but dry, covered in a layer of pine needles. I set down my pack and began to unpack the tent, carefully clearing stones and sticks so the base would be flat. I worked slowly, methodically, enjoying the silence, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath around me. I started a small fire with my lighter and a handful of dry twigs, enough to keep warm as the temperature dropped, but not so large that it would attract unwanted attention. The first night fell quickly. Darkness in the forest is different from darkness in a city. There are no streetlights, no passing cars, no glow from distant buildings. Here, the blackness is dense, nearly solid, pressing in from all sides. I ate a simple dinner from my backpack, beans and dried meat, washing it down with water from my bottle, careful not to disturb the quiet. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds around me. There was the rustle of animals moving in the underbrush, perhaps deer, perhaps smaller creatures. Every snap of a twig made me tense, but I reminded myself that I was prepared. This was nature. I knew the forest was alive, and I was just a visitor. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the tent. My plan was to explore a nearby ridge that overlooked a small valley. I packed my gear, left my camp tidy, and set off. The terrain was steep, and my legs burned from the climb. The forest grew thicker, the trail less distinct. I relied heavily on my map and compass, marking my progress by unique trees and large rocks. Around midday, I reached the ridge. The view was incredible. Rolling hills blanketed in green, the forest stretching as far as I could see. I rested, taking deep breaths, feeling the sweat cool on my skin. It was then that I first noticed something strange. From this high vantage point, I saw a figure moving through the trees in the valley below. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but the movement was deliberate, slow, and careful. I couldn't see details, only the dark outline. My pulse quickened. I had planned for wildlife encounters, but humans in this area were rare. I decided to stay on the ridge for a while, observing. The figure moved closer to the trees near my camp. I could feel my stomach knot with unease. Was it a lost hiker? Someone camping illegally? My mind raced with possibilities. I descended cautiously, keeping my movements slow and deliberate so as not to alert the person below. By the time I reached my campsite, I saw signs that someone had been near. A few branches were broken, and the ground showed faint footprints that weren't mine. Panic prickled at my skin. I had my small knife on my belt and my flashlight ready, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just another camper, maybe they were just passing through. I reinforced the tent and ensured my fire was still smoldering. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and the isolation that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt suffocating. That night, I slept poorly. Every sound made me startle. The wind through the pines became a chorus of whispers, and the snapping of distant branches made me sit up repeatedly. I imagined someone circling my camp, watching. I told myself that the fear was in my mind, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I lay in the tent, listening to the forest breathing, unable to rest. The hours crawled by. In the morning, I made a plan. I couldn't stay. I had enough supplies for a few more days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I packed my gear efficiently, double-checked my map, and began my trek out. I tried to remain calm, keeping my senses alert. The forest that had seemed inviting now felt oppressive, every shadow heavy. The trail was harder than I remembered, with fallen trees and loose rocks. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. Around midday, I crossed a shallow creek. As I stepped on the slippery stones, I lost my balance and fell, twisting my ankle. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and immediate. I sat on a rock, gritting my teeth, trying to figure out what to do. The ankle was swollen quickly, and walking was difficult. Panic returned in waves. I had no signal on my phone, no way to call for help. The forest felt endless and my isolation absolute. I realized that the figure I had seen yesterday might still be nearby. The thought of encountering another human with unknown intentions in this remote area made my skin crawl. I made the difficult decision to move slowly, resting frequently, using a sturdy branch as a crutch. Every movement was agonizing, but I refused to give up. I told myself I would reach the main trail, where I could get help or eventually find a ranger station. Hours passed. The sun dropped lower, and the shadows lengthened. I kept a constant vigil, listening, scanning, every sense heightened. I felt completely exposed, yet I kept going, step by step, driven by the need to survive. As dusk fell, I saw smoke in the distance. My heart leapt. Maybe it was a campfire from other hikers or a ranger patrol. I followed the scent and the thin tendrils of smoke, stumbling through underbrush. Soon, I emerged onto a wider trail, more distinct than the path I had been on. Relief surged through me, but I stayed alert, wary of anyone who might be around. After another hour, I came across a small ranger station. A lone ranger was finishing up for the day. I approached slowly, limping, explaining my situation. The ranger offered immediate assistance, checking my ankle and giving me water. Relief was overwhelming. They arranged transportation back to the nearest road, assuring me that everything would be okay. As I sat in the ranger's vehicle, I looked back at the forest. The fear that had gripped me, the feeling of being watched, the constant tension, it all began to recede. I realized that I had been extremely lucky. In the days after the incident, I reflected on what had happened. I realized that isolation in a wild area is not just about distance from civilization. It is about vulnerability. I had been careful, but the forest is unpredictable. Humans are unpredictable too. I had survived because I stayed calm, because I planned as best as I could, and because I refused to give up despite the fear and pain. That experience left a mark. I no longer see the forest as merely beautiful and peaceful. I see it as powerful and demanding, requiring respect and vigilance. The story of that trip spread quietly among friends and colleagues. I avoided exaggeration, sticking to the facts. The fear I felt was real, but the lessons were clear. I learned the importance of preparation, of always having a way to call for help, of never underestimating isolation and fatigue. Most importantly, I learned that fear is not always irrational. It is a tool, a survival mechanism that can keep you alive when danger is near. I returned to the woods later, but never alone, never in the same remote area, and never without a solid plan and backup. The incident taught me something profound. Nature is not forgiving of carelessness. Humans are not predictable. Survival depends on knowledge, awareness, and caution. That terrifying week changed my perception of camping and the outdoors. I still seek adventure, still value solitude, but I have learned to temper it with respect and preparation. In the end, I survived, my body healed, my mind sharpened. The forest remains, as wild and untamed as ever, but I carry its lessons with me, a constant reminder of the fine line between wonder and danger. I had always liked the idea of going camping alone. There was something about being entirely on my own in the woods, away from roads, traffic, and people, that felt like reclaiming a small piece of the world for myself. I had gone on short hikes before, and I had been on group camping trips, but nothing prepared me for the deep isolation of truly being alone in a forest I had never visited before. I drove for hours, following a map I had printed weeks earlier, until I reached the trailhead of a small, unmarked path that promised a primitive camping area about 10 miles in. The area was known for its dense woods, a river running through it, and steep hills. The trail started narrow and rocky, and I parked my car at a small clearing, checked my backpack for the last time, and set off on foot. The first few hours went well. The trail was clear, and I kept my pace steady, stopping only to rest briefly or take water. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the smell of wet soil and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the forest floor with shifting patches of light and shadow. Birds sang intermittently, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth reminded me that I was not entirely alone. I welcomed it. It made the woods feel alive and real. As the afternoon passed, I began to notice small signs that the area wasn't heavily trafficked. Fallen branches lay across parts of the path, and moss grew thick along the edges where people rarely walked. I had read that isolated trails could be tricky to navigate, so I kept my map open, comparing it to the markings on the trees and the faint trail indicators. I wanted to reach my camping spot before sunset, and I estimated I had a couple of hours left. The trail began to climb more steeply, and my legs burned as I hoisted my backpack higher onto my shoulders. I was sweating despite the cool air. The trail twisted between tall pines and oaks, the roots forming natural steps. Every few minutes, I paused to catch my breath and to listen, trying to pick out any unusual sounds. The forest was quieter now, and the absence of human noise made every snap of a twig or distant bird call feel louder, more pronounced. Eventually, I reached a small ridge overlooking a bend in the river. From this height, I could see where I planned to set up camp. A small clearing beside the water, partially shielded by trees. The river flowed swiftly, its surface reflecting the orange and pink hues of the late afternoon sun. I felt a surge of relief, knowing I had found the spot I had aimed for. Setting up camp took time. I unloaded my backpack, secured the tent on a relatively flat patch of ground, and built a small fire pit with stones I collected nearby. I kept the fire small, enough to cook but not to draw unnecessary attention, knowing that in an area like this, I could easily start a forest fire if I wasn't careful. I gathered some dry wood and kindling, arranging it for the evening. I boiled water over the fire, ate a simple meal, and then sat beside the river for a while, just watching the water and listening to the forest as shadows deepened around me. Night came quickly in the woods. I had chosen this spot partly because it was sheltered, but I had underestimated how dark it could get once the sun set. The forest seemed to absorb all light. I had a headlamp and a small flashlight, but I tried not to rely on them too much, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The sounds of nocturnal animals increased. Distant owls, the occasional splash in the river, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I felt safe enough, but a nagging unease began to creep in. It wasn't fear of anything supernatural. It was the simple, deep awareness that I was completely alone in a vast, wild place, and if anything went wrong, there would be no one to help me. I went to sleep that night with the tent zipper closed tightly, the rainfly secured. I slept lightly, waking intermittently to the sound of the wind through the trees or the shifting of some animal nearby. The first night passed without incident, though I barely rested. The next morning, I woke to a mist rising from the river. The forest smelled damp and fresh, and the air was cool against my skin. I packed some breakfast and decided to explore the area more thoroughly before returning to camp. I wanted to familiarize myself with my surroundings, especially the trail back. The forest seemed even denser in the daylight than it had from the ridge, and every step reminded me how easy it would be to get lost. As I walked, I noticed small signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, scratch marks on tree trunks, and the occasional scat told me that I was sharing this space with animals, some potentially dangerous. I reminded myself to stay alert. The forest was beautiful, but it demanded respect. I kept my hiking stick ready, my eyes scanning constantly. By midday, I returned to camp, sweating from the exertion and relieved to sit by the river. I cooked a simple lunch and tried to relax. But soon, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud near the riverbank that hadn't been there yesterday. I studied them carefully. They were human, but they were large and looked recent. My stomach tightened. I had read about hikers encountering others in the backcountry, but the thought of someone wandering near my campsite without my knowledge made my nerves jump. I checked the perimeter. Nothing. The forest looked undisturbed beyond the footprints. My rational mind told me it could have been someone who had camped upstream or downstream, but the unease lingered. I kept my knife close, made sure my firewood was arranged, and resolved to stay alert. As evening approached, I noticed the sun dropping faster than I expected. Clouds were forming, and a cold wind began to blow. I double-checked my tent, making sure everything was secure. I gathered more firewood, knowing I would need a bigger fire if the night turned colder. By the time darkness fell, the wind had picked up considerably, and the forest was filled with the sound of rustling leaves, snapping branches, and the river rushing by. That night, I didn't sleep well. The combination of isolation, strange footprints, and the wind made my mind restless. Around midnight, I woke to a sudden sound outside the tent. It was subtle but deliberate, a footstep on the soft forest floor. My heart raced. I stayed completely still, listening. Another step, closer this time. Then another. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't making mistakes. They were moving with purpose. I didn't move. I didn't breathe audibly. I kept my eyes on the tent wall, imagining the shadows moving. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. I couldn't tell if the person had left or was waiting. I stayed awake, gripping my knife, listening to every sound. Hours passed this way, the wind howling, the river roaring, and my mind running through every scenario I had never wanted to consider. By dawn, the footsteps had not returned, and I was exhausted but alive. I waited until full light broke before leaving the tent. I surveyed the area carefully. Nothing, no sign of anyone. I packed my gear slowly, my hands shaking slightly from lack of sleep and adrenaline. I knew I had to get out of the forest and back to civilization before something worse happened. I began my hike back on the trail. The path seemed longer than before, every tree and shadow triggering memories of the previous night. My mind replayed every sound, every movement I hadn't understood. I kept checking behind me, even though logically there was nothing I could do if someone had been there. The thought of confrontation was terrifying, but I knew panic wouldn't help. I walked steadily, maintaining focus on the trail markers. Hours passed. My legs ached, my backpack felt heavier than ever, and my water supply was running low. Finally, I reached the ridge I had seen the day before. The sunlight was brighter now, filtering through the forest canopy, and I could see the trailhead in the distance. Relief surged through me. I moved faster, pushing myself, desperate to leave the isolated stretch behind. When I reached my car, I collapsed against it, feeling the warmth of the metal through my sweaty clothes. I looked back at the forest, dense and silent now, and realized I would never forget the feeling of being completely alone, aware that someone or something had passed near me in the dark. I sat in the car for a long time, drinking water and catching my breath. I called a friend as soon as I had cell signal just to hear a voice. In the following days, I told myself the footprints had belonged to a lost hiker or a hunter passing through, but the memory stayed with me. The fear of being so isolated, the tension of knowing someone could be near and unseen, and the extreme effort to remain calm under pressure. It stayed with me in vivid detail. I learned to respect the woods not just for their beauty but for their unpredictability. The story ended that day not with disaster, but with a clear understanding. I had survived the night, made it back safely, and learned more about preparation, awareness, and caution than I ever had before. I knew I would go camping again, but I would be smarter, more vigilant, and never underestimate the forest or the people who moved through it. The woods were beautiful, yes, but they were real and they demanded respect. And I had earned mine that night. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I had carefully chosen a remote section of the forest, far from any main roads, a place where the trails were narrow and barely marked, the kind of place where people rarely went, and where the sounds of the city were a distant memory. I wanted isolation. I wanted to be alone with nature, to test myself and my skills. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, extra food, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a pocket knife, a small portable stove, and enough water for several days. I even brought a handheld GPS device and a compass, though I felt confident in my ability to navigate using the map I had studied so many times. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, when the sun was still low, casting long, sharp shadows between the trees. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I locked my car, hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, and set off down the narrow dirt trail. The first few hours were uneventful, almost soothing. Birds called in the distance, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the soft crunch of my boots against the soil was the only sound I made. The trail climbed gradually, passing a small stream that glinted in the sunlight. I stopped to fill my water bottle, the cold water shocking my hands but refreshing. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for my campsite. It was slightly elevated with a flat, dry area surrounded by tall pines. Fallen leaves and pine needles created a soft carpet on the ground. I set up my tent carefully, staking it firmly and arranging my gear inside. I collected firewood, stacking small branches in a neat pile, and built a small fire pit surrounded by stones. As I sat there, staring at the sun beginning to dip behind the trees, I felt a thrill of satisfaction. I had my little base in the middle of nowhere, my sanctuary. As night fell, the forest changed. Shadows deepened, and the air cooled quickly. I built a fire and sat close to it, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. The crackling flames illuminated the trees around me, throwing flickering shapes onto the trunks. In the distance, I could hear the occasional sound of wildlife. A deer crashing through underbrush, the soft scuttling of some small animal, and the distant howl of a coyote. It was exhilarating and unnerving at the same time. I felt the isolation keenly, but I also felt alive in a way that city life never allowed. Around midnight, the sounds of the forest grew sharper. I was lying in my sleeping bag inside the tent when I heard something unusual. A soft rustling, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was moving carefully through the underbrush nearby. My heart rate quickened. I reminded myself that it was probably a deer or a raccoon, anything normal, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I listened intently. The sound stopped for a while, then started again, closer this time. I shone my headlamp outside the tent, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. The forest was a solid wall of black beyond the reach of the light. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that I was alone and safe. Still, I could not sleep. I stayed awake, listening to the night, aware of every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Hours passed like this. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move at the edge of the firelight, but it could have been my imagination. I reminded myself over and over that I was trained, that I had been on long hikes before, and that no one lived in this part of the forest. Around 3 a.m., I heard the sound again, louder this time. It was deliberate, slow, methodical. Someone was moving around my campsite. My stomach dropped. I reached for my knife, my hands shaking slightly. I stayed still, trying to assess. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic crunching of leaves, moving from the edge of the clearing toward me. I could make out a shape now, moving cautiously through the trees, just beyond the firelight. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? A hiker who had gotten lost? My thoughts shifted quickly to darker possibilities. Someone with ill intent. Someone who had seen the smoke from my fire and decided to follow me. I remained completely still. The shape moved closer, and I realized it was moving with deliberate caution, as if aware that I could be armed. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing shallow. I tried to think through my options. I could leave quietly, but I would have to get through the darkness with only a headlamp, and it might alert whoever or whatever was out there. I could stay put and hope they moved on, but I knew the firelight made me an easy target to spot. Suddenly, a snapping sound nearby made me freeze completely. My flashlight illuminated a figure, a man dressed in dark clothing, barely discernible from the shadows. He paused, almost like he was assessing the situation, and then crouched behind a tree, watching. My mind raced. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted. I did not want to provoke him, and I knew I could not outrun him in the dark. I felt trapped, alone, vulnerable. I remembered my training for wilderness survival. The most important thing was to remain calm and conserve energy, to avoid confrontation if possible. I slowly reached for my phone, making sure to keep it inside the sleeping bag, using the dim screen to check my GPS. I noted my location. I knew the nearest ranger station was several miles away, but there was a chance I could get there before he realized I was preparing to leave. I decided I needed to act carefully. I waited, watching the man move slowly, his movements cautious, deliberate. I realized he had not made a sound, no attempt to call out or communicate. This was not someone lost, not someone curious. There was a menace in the way he moved, a calculated patience. I knew I needed to get out, but I had to wait for the right moment. I focused on staying calm, controlling my breathing, listening intently to every sound in the forest. After what felt like an eternity, the man moved away from the clearing, disappearing into the trees. I waited for several minutes longer to be sure, then slowly and quietly unzipped my tent, careful not to make a sound. I grabbed my pack and headed toward the trail, keeping low and moving silently. My heart was racing, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. I followed the trail as best I could, relying on the GPS and my memory of the map. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept moving, knowing that stopping could be dangerous. Hours passed as I navigated the dark forest. The adrenaline and fear kept me alert, but also exhausted. My legs ached, my back screamed from the heavy pack, but I could not stop. Occasionally, I heard movement behind me and froze, only to realize it was the wind or some small animal. I pressed on, keeping a careful watch. By dawn, I reached a small ridge that gave me a view of a road far below. Relief surged through me. I carefully descended toward it, every step cautious. By mid-morning, I reached the road. Passing car stopped when I flagged it down. I explained that I had been camping alone and that someone had been following me in the forest. The driver took me to the nearest ranger station. The rangers were skeptical at first, but listened carefully as I explained my route and the events of the night. They organized a search of the area. I gave them a detailed description of the man, the location, and the sequence of events. The rangers confirmed that the forest was often used by people who hiked illegally or camped without registration. They said they had found evidence of someone living temporarily in the area, possibly watching hikers. I was shaken but relieved to be safe. They offered to escort me back to my car and to check the surrounding trails for safety. As I drove home, the reality of what had happened sank in. I had been extremely lucky. My planning, preparation, and calm thinking had allowed me to avoid confrontation and escape safely. I realized that the forest could be beautiful and serene, but it was also unpredictable and could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with wild animals or supernatural threats. In the following weeks, I reflected on the experience constantly. I reinforced my knowledge of wilderness survival, updated my gear, and trained myself to remain calm in emergencies. I never returned to that part of the forest, but I carried the lessons with me on every future hike. I knew now that fear was not an enemy. It was a tool, a signal to stay alert, to respect the environment, and to trust my own judgment. The experience stayed with me for years. Every time I went camping or hiking, I made sure I was fully prepared, fully aware of my surroundings, and never alone in areas that could be dangerous. I told myself that I had faced real fear and come through it alive. I had learned that preparation, patience, and careful observation could save a life. I also learned to respect the forest in a new way. Its beauty came with the potential for real danger, and that danger required caution and vigilance. I never forgot the feeling of that night. The darkness pressing down, the sense of being watched, the adrenaline that kept me moving when exhaustion wanted to stop me. But I also never forgot the relief and clarity that came when I finally reached the road and realized I had survived. The forest had taught me a lesson I could not unlearn, and though I continued to seek solitude in nature, I did so with a newfound respect for the reality of the wilderness and the potential threats hidden in its shadows. I had planned the camping trip for months. I wanted a break from everything: work, the city, the constant noise and movement. I needed silence, something simple, something that reminded me of being small again when the world didn't feel so heavy. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any real roads or trails. The kind of place where your phone might not work and the nearest other humans could be miles away. I had gone alone before, but this time I felt a pull to go deeper, to truly be alone with nothing but the forest and myself. I packed carefully, making sure I had everything I might need: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water, some canned food, a first aid kit, extra batteries, flashlight, and a map of the area. I left my car at the edge of the forest and carried my pack for hours, moving slowly, carefully, absorbing the quiet. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine and earth. Birds were scattered across the treetops, their calls occasionally piercing the calm. I passed small streams and clearings where sunlight hit the ground in golden patches. I felt alive, free. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect, a flat area surrounded by tall pines, with enough space to set up my tent, and a small ridge nearby where I could see the surroundings. There was a stream not far off, trickling gently, which meant water was available, and I could hear the faint hum of insects and rustling leaves as the day passed. I unpacked, set up the tent, and arranged my small camp with care. I started a fire, the smell of smoke filling the forest. I cooked some food, simple things, canned beans, some dry bread, and water boiled from the stream. The light was fading, but it was beautiful, a soft glow sinking behind the trees, the forest turning from green to dark gray, shadows lengthening, twisting. I sat by the fire for a long time, just watching, listening to the forest settle in for the night. As the sky darkened completely, the forest felt different. The sounds were sharper. Small creatures scurried in the underbrush. The wind through the trees carried a hollow whisper that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was a normal forest, but it felt enormous, alive in a way I wasn't used to. I went into the tent to sleep, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Not supernatural, just something. Humans, animals, anything. I told myself it was the isolation, the unfamiliar sounds of the night. I slept fitfully. I kept waking up, hearing the snapping of twigs, rustling close by, a faint crunch like something stepping carefully. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was probably deer or raccoons. I kept my flashlight within reach and my knife strapped to my side, the practicality of it giving me some comfort. In the morning, I decided to explore further, to walk along the stream, follow it deeper into the forest. I wanted to see more, understand the area. I left my camp, carrying a small pack with water, food, and essentials, and followed the sound of flowing water. The forest opened and closed in layers, some parts dense, others lighter with moss and soft earth. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my senses heightened, noticing every rustle, every broken branch. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless. I started to realize I had lost the exact sense of direction. My map helped, but everything looked the same. Tall pines, fallen logs, scattered rocks. I could retrace steps if I needed, but the forest had a way of repeating itself, and I began to notice that landmarks weren't always reliable. I felt a slight knot of unease, a tension that grew as the sun moved behind clouds, thinning the light. Around mid-afternoon, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A small campsite, abandoned, with remnants of a fire, torn pieces of a tarp, footprints pressed into the soft earth. I knew it could have been anyone, another camper, a hunter, but something about the way it was left, hastily, gave me pause. The footprints were still there, some fresh, some older. I had the sudden realization that someone had been here recently, possibly watching or passing through. I decided not to linger. I walked back toward the area I thought my camp was in, but by the time I realized I was disoriented, I was too far from familiar landmarks. Panic started to rise, a creeping tension that made my stomach knot. I stopped to think, to breathe, and tried to recall my path, retracing mentally. The stream was my guide, but even that seemed to twist in unexpected ways. Every turn I took looked the same. Tall trees, moss-covered logs, shadows stretching unnaturally. Night was coming again, faster than I expected. The forest's calm I had enjoyed the day before was gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet. The wind had died down, leaving only the sounds of distant water and my own footsteps. I set my flashlight on high, scanning the trees as I walked, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. I had no idea how far I had gone, or how far I was from my camp. The sun was low, and the forest felt enormous, suffocating, a place that could swallow me without a trace. I realized I needed shelter before it got completely dark. I spotted a small rise and cleared a tiny area to set a makeshift camp. Not a proper tent, just enough to huddle and have some cover. I gathered twigs and small branches for firewood, my hands shaking slightly. I managed to get a small fire going. The light was weak, but it gave me something. I could feel the heat on my face, the small comfort of flames, and yet the forest felt endless, shadows lurking beyond the glow. Hours passed. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. Every snap, every rustle, every sigh of wind made me tense. I imagined humans moving through the dark, maybe following me. I imagined animals, predators, eyes reflecting faintly in the firelight. I kept my knife close, my flashlight ready. My mind raced through every worst-case scenario, each one plausible. I had experience with the outdoors, but this felt different. I was alone, lost, and vulnerable. By dawn, exhaustion hit me. I hadn't slept well, and the cold had seeped into my bones. I knew I had to move to find my camp or some recognizable point. I packed quickly, leaving behind anything non-essential. The forest looked different in the early light, less threatening but still vast and overwhelming. I walked carefully, trying to follow what I thought was the direction of my original camp. Hours passed. I saw nothing familiar. My stomach knotted with hunger and fatigue. At one point, I stumbled upon a set of human tracks. They were fresh. My pulse jumped. I wasn't sure whether to feel relief or terror. Relief because it meant someone was nearby, or terror because I didn't know who. I followed cautiously, moving slowly, alert to every sound. The tracks led through thick underbrush, over fallen logs, along streams, deeper into the forest. I didn't know whether following them was wise, but I felt I had no other choice. By midday, the forest opened into a ridge I vaguely recognized. My camp. I could see my tent in the distance, slightly flattened from wind or rain overnight. Relief hit me in a wave so strong it almost made me collapse. I ran the last few hundred meters, my legs trembling from fatigue, my lungs burning. My small fire from the previous night had died, leaving only a circle of ash. I quickly set up my camp properly again, feeling the first real sense of safety I'd had in over 24 hours. The rest of the day passed slowly. I drank water, ate conservatively, and forced myself to rest while keeping my senses alert. I knew the forest could be deceptive, and the sense of unease lingered. At night, I stayed close to the fire, but sleep came easier this time. I felt a sense of accomplishment, tempered by respect for the forest's vastness and the real danger of being unprepared. The following morning, I packed my camp carefully, taking mental notes of the landmarks as I walked back toward the car. The forest, though beautiful, had reminded me of how fragile human presence can be in a place that operates on its own rules. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, every shadow had felt like a test of alertness and endurance. I walked slowly but steadily, the sun higher now, warmth in my shoulders, guiding me. By late afternoon, I reached my car. The relief was overwhelming. The forest was behind me now, a memory of tension, exhaustion, and vigilance. I loaded my pack, feeling a deep gratitude for the safety of the familiar world. The metal of the car, the road beneath my tires, the distant sound of civilization. I drove slowly, looking back at the trees that had nearly swallowed me, feeling a mixture of awe and fear. That trip stayed with me long after. I learned that being alone in nature isn't just about solitude. It's about respect, awareness, and preparation. The forest isn't malevolent, but it is indifferent, vast, and precise in its own way. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what lurks in the shadows. It's how small and unprepared you can feel when you realize just how alone you really are. I never underestimated planning or caution again, and every time I return to the woods now, I do so with the knowledge that nature doesn't need to be haunted to be terrifying. It is terrifying simply by existing on its own terms, and surviving it requires humility, attention, and patience. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of getting away from the city, away from the noise, away from people had consumed me for weeks. I wasn't looking for adventure, at least not the kind that shows up in movies or TV shows. I just wanted quiet, some time alone in the woods, a chance to breathe and think. I picked a spot I had read about online, a small national forest that wasn't well known, a place without crowds and without the usual campgrounds where everyone parks and leaves their trash. I wanted solitude. I wanted nature. I wanted peace. I packed my car meticulously. I made lists and checked them twice, making sure I had enough food, water, and warm clothes. I packed my sleeping bag, tent, camping stove, and some extra batteries for my flashlight. I carried a small first aid kit, some maps, and my phone, though I knew there would be little to no signal once I got deep into the forest. I left early in the morning, the sky barely pink with the first hints of sunrise, the roads quiet and still. The drive was long, winding, and increasingly narrow. Asphalt gave way to gravel and then to dirt, until I was bouncing along a trail that looked more like a path made by trucks or hikers than an actual road. By mid-morning, I parked near a small clearing. From the road, I could see the forest thickening, trees standing close together, their branches brushing against each other, leaves whispering in the wind. I grabbed my gear and started walking, following a trail I thought I had marked on my map. The path was uneven, roots jutting out, mud in some places from recent rain. Birds were singing in the distance, but otherwise the forest was quiet. I walked for hours, following the trail and occasionally checking my map, until I found what I thought was the perfect spot. A small clearing by a stream, the water clear and shallow, sunlight cutting through the trees in thin lines. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was level, staking it down in the soil. I gathered firewood, small branches and dry leaves, enough to get a fire going at night. I explored the area briefly, noting where the stream widened, where the trees thinned, and where I could place my food safely away from animals. The day passed slowly, the sunlight shifting as I rested and ate. I was alone and I liked it, but there was an edge of unease I tried to ignore. The forest felt too still at times, like it was holding its breath. Birds would suddenly go silent, and the rustling of leaves seemed louder than it should be. As the afternoon faded, I prepared for the night. I started a small fire near the tent, careful to keep it contained, using stones I had gathered around the clearing. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks into the air. I cooked some food, ate slowly, savoring the taste, and watched the water move gently over the rocks. Night came quickly. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in shades of red and purple before finally fading into deep blue. Darkness settled over the forest, heavy and absolute. That's when I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the forest being alive, the wind moving through the trees, branches rubbing together. But soon I noticed the sounds were closer, sharper, more deliberate. Snap of a twig, rustle of leaves, heavy footsteps, crunching over dry foliage. I sat very still, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, straining to see anything beyond the small circle of light around my fire. My heart began to beat faster. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the pattern of the steps didn't match anything I had heard before in the forest. It was deliberate, slow, cautious, like something was moving through the trees with intent, not just wandering. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks, underbrush, and shadows, but nothing moved. The sound stopped as soon as the light shone near it. I lowered the flashlight, my hands shaking slightly, telling myself to calm down, that it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. But then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Not in a straight line, but circling, moving closer. My stomach turned cold. I was trained to stay calm, to think logically. I reminded myself that most forest animals avoid humans. Still, the steps kept coming, slow and careful, echoing in the quiet night. I decided to stay inside my tent, sliding the zipper closed. I could hear the movement outside, occasionally a branch snapping, leaves rustling, and my mind raced. I checked my phone, hoping for signal, anything, but there was none. I realized then how isolated I really was. No road within miles, no other campers. Just me, the forest, and whatever was moving outside. I tried to stay calm, breathing slowly, but sleep was impossible. Every small sound made me tense. Every shadow outside the thin tent walls seemed like it was moving closer. Hours passed. I don't know exactly how long I was awake, listening to the night. At one point, I dared to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The forest was black, almost impenetrable, but I could see faint shapes among the trees. I saw nothing moving, but I knew something had been walking around my campsite. I felt a weight of fear pressing down, a realization that I was completely alone and vulnerable. At some point, I heard a low growl, unmistakable this time. It was deep, guttural, and it came from very close. My stomach sank. I had packed for bears, maybe coyotes, but I had always assumed the chance of a real threat was low. Now I knew I had to act. I grabbed my bear spray from the tent, made sure my flashlight was charged, and prepared for the possibility that something could come at me. I could hear the steps again, circling, moving closer, sometimes stopping as if assessing me. I realized that the safest place was not the tent, but standing by my fire, making myself as visible and threatening as possible. I grabbed a stick, shaking slightly, and sat next to the fire, waiting. I don't know how long I waited. Every minute felt like an hour. I saw eyes reflecting in the faint light once, far enough away that I couldn't identify the animal, but close enough to make my heart race. I made loud noises, banging on a pot I had, shouting into the dark, hoping to scare it off. The steps retreated slightly, then circled again, always keeping a distance, always aware of me. Eventually, the growls faded. The forest returned to silence. I stayed awake until the first hints of dawn, too tense to sleep. When the sun finally began to rise, everything changed. The forest seemed safer, less oppressive. I could see the trees, the underbrush, the tracks in the dirt. I discovered that some large animal had been around my campsite overnight. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, deep paw prints. I realized it had been a bear, a large one, curious enough to investigate my camp, but not aggressive enough to attack. My relief was immense, but tempered by the knowledge that I had been extremely lucky. I packed up quickly, keeping my eyes and ears alert. I left the fire pit as I had found it, taking all my food and supplies with me. I followed the trail back to the car, moving quickly but carefully. Every rustle made me tense, every shadow a reminder of the night before. When I finally reached the car, sunlight filtering through the forest canopy, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I locked the doors, got in, and started the engine. Driving away, I glanced back at the trees, still standing silent and imposing. The fear of the night lingered, but so did a strange sense of accomplishment. I had faced real danger, survived it, and learned the true weight of being alone in the wilderness. I never camped in a remote forest alone again. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly nature can shift from peaceful to threatening, and how careful, prepared, and aware one must always be. I still love the woods, still go hiking and camping, but I never underestimate the risks. I always carry bear spray, I always make noise, and I never stay in one spot for too long without knowing exactly what is around me. That night changed how I saw the world and my place in it. Taught me fear, but also respect, and in the end, survival. I had been planning the trip for months, poring over maps and trail reviews, checking the weather forecasts obsessively, and making sure every piece of gear was in perfect condition. I wanted to get away from the city for a few days, away from the noise, away from people, away from everything. I had rented a small, remote camping spot in the mountains, far from the main trails, where there were only a few sparse campsites and no cell signal for miles. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of peace that comes from being surrounded only by trees, rocks, and the wind. I thought I was prepared, but I wasn't prepared for what would actually happen. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the ridges of the mountains. The air was sharp, cold in the shade, warm where the sun still hit. I parked my car and began the hike with a heavy pack on my shoulders. The weight pressed into my back and shoulders, reminding me constantly that I had chosen this solitude willingly. The trail wound upward, twisting between trees and over rocks, following the ridge that would eventually lead to the campsite. There was a faint scent of pine in the air, mingled with the dry smell of dirt and the faint musk of animals. I passed small streams that gurgled over stones, the water clear and cold. Birds flitted overhead, sometimes landing briefly on low branches, watching me before taking off again. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was almost gone, leaving only a dim golden light through the trees. The spot I had chosen was small, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a rock outcropping forming one side of the clearing. It was isolated just as I wanted. I set down my pack and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine and earth, a clean scent that made my chest feel full. I spent the next hour setting up my tent, arranging my sleeping bag, laying out my gear in a way that felt organized, methodical. I started a small fire using dry kindling I had packed and some twigs from the ground, taking care to keep it controlled, building it low and contained. I knew how fast a mountain fire could spread, and I wasn't taking any chances. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The wind moved through the trees, making them sway and creak. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint howl of a coyote. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush kept me alert. I lay in my sleeping bag for hours, listening, trying to convince myself I was safe, but my body refused to relax completely. My mind kept drifting to what could happen, to the fact that I was alone in the wilderness. But that was the risk I had chosen, and I had to face it. The next morning, I woke early. Mist clung to the forest floor, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I packed a small day bag with water, some snacks, and my camera. I planned to explore a little further along the ridge, a loop that would take me past a small waterfall I had read about in a hiking forum. The trail was steep, winding, and covered in loose rocks. Every step had to be deliberate, and I found myself constantly checking my footing. Halfway through the hike, the mist lifted slightly, revealing the forest stretching out in every direction. A sea of green punctuated by the gray of rocks. The silence was profound. No traffic, no voices, no machines. Only the sound of the water in the distant stream, the wind in the trees, and the occasional bird. As I approached the waterfall, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints in the mud, fresh, leading toward the waterfall and then disappearing along the trail beyond. They were not animal prints. They were human. I froze, scanning the area. There was no one in sight. The thought of another person out here was unsettling. I had been careful to pick a secluded spot, and the presence of someone else, potentially unprepared or unpredictable, made me uneasy. I checked the direction of the footprints. They were deep, heavy, as if whoever had made them carried weight, and they were heading in the same direction I was planning to go. I debated turning back, but curiosity, mixed with a sense of stubbornness, made me continue. The waterfall itself was beautiful, cascading over moss-covered rocks into a clear pool below. The water was cold and smelled fresh. I knelt to touch it, letting the icy liquid run over my fingers. The sound of the water was hypnotic, a constant roar that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing off the rocks. I took some photos, trying to capture the beauty, but my attention kept drifting back to the footprints. I could feel my pulse quicken, a low hum of anxiety running through my body. I decided to head back to camp, keeping my eyes on the trail. As I walked, the sense of being watched grew. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the feeling didn't go away. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I tried to keep my pace steady, but my breathing was uneven. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already dipping low, shadows stretching long across the ground. My tent looked exactly as I had left it, the fire pit cold but intact. For a moment I felt relief, but that relief was short-lived. As I unpacked and prepared to start a new fire for the evening, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were more footprints closer to the tent. They were larger, heavier, more deliberate. They circled my campsite, then disappeared toward the trees. Someone had been here while I was gone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I checked my pack, making sure everything was where I left it. Nothing was missing, but the presence of someone else, this close, in the darkening forest, made my anxiety spike. I built the fire quickly, sitting close to it, watching the shadows. Every sound, every movement, made me tense. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, almost aware of me. Night fell and the forest changed. The wind picked up, making the trees groan. The darkness was thick, impenetrable. The firelight created shifting shadows that danced across the trees. Every sound was amplified. The crack of a branch, the scuttle of a small animal, the distant roar of a larger animal moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see the sky through the dense canopy, and I realized I had no sense of direction, no way to gauge where anyone or anything might be. Around midnight, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the underbrush. Not far, but not close enough to see. Slow, methodical, almost like whoever it was wanted to be heard. My heart pounded. I grabbed a long stick, checking the edge of the firelight. The forest beyond was black, a solid wall of shadows. The sound stopped abruptly. My body froze, muscles tense. I waited, every nerve alert. Minutes passed. The forest returned to silence. I told myself I had imagined it, but I hadn't. The footprints earlier had proven someone had been here, and I had no way of knowing if they were still around. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, fire dying down, eyes wide, listening to the forest. I checked my pack repeatedly, making sure everything was secure. I thought about leaving, hiking back in the dark, but I knew that was dangerous. The trail was steep and treacherous in daylight. In the dark, it could be deadly. I decided to wait until first light. When morning came, pale and gray through the trees, I could barely believe I had survived the night. Everything was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I packed my gear quickly, leaving the campsite exactly as I had found it. But I kept one hand on my stick and my eyes constantly scanning. The trail back down was steep, and I had to move carefully, making sure I didn't slip. Every shadow made me tense. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I made it back to the trailhead without incident, my legs shaking, my body exhausted. I didn't see anyone, but the experience left a mark. I had planned this trip to be peaceful, solitary, and beautiful. It had been all of those things, but it had also been terrifying. A reminder that the wilderness is beautiful, yes, but also unpredictable and dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with fairy tales or ghosts. Back in my car, I took a deep breath. The city smells hitting me like a shock after the clean mountain air. I knew I had been lucky. I had prepared carefully, moved cautiously, and yet someone had been out there close enough to be a real threat. The experience changed the way I approached every outdoor trip afterward. I never stopped going, but I learned to respect the isolation, to expect unpredictability, and to be prepared for anything. That camping trip was supposed to be an escape, and it was, but it was also a lesson about solitude, danger, and survival in a place where the rules are not written for humans but for nature itself. Even now, thinking back, I remember the way the firelight played on the trees, the smell of pine and dirt, the sound of footsteps in the darkness. I remember the fear, sharp and real, and the relief of reaching the car. I learned that the wilderness is not empty. It is full of life, full of threats, full of unpredictability. And if you are not careful, it can test you in ways you never imagined. I had been planning the camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything. Work, city noise, the constant hum of people around me, and just be alone with the forest. I found a trail online that led deep into the mountains, far from any main roads, rivers, or even other campers. The descriptions made it sound isolated, untouched, and beautiful. It was exactly what I wanted. I packed my bag carefully, making sure I had everything I might need. A heavy-duty tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a portable stove, extra food, water, a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight with spare batteries, a map, and a compass. I also carried a small hiking axe just in case. I double-checked everything multiple times. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. The drive up to the trailhead was long. The road narrowed into a rough, unpaved path, winding between tall trees and steep cliffs. My car rattled over rocks and potholes, but I kept going, focusing on the isolation ahead. I had no cell service once I left the main road, but I had accepted that. In fact, that was part of the appeal, being unreachable. I parked at the trailhead in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and wet earth. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to ease. The trail began gently, winding through dense trees and moss-covered rocks. The forest was quiet, but not dead quiet. Birds chirped occasionally, and I could hear the distant hum of a stream somewhere below. The path narrowed as I went deeper, with tree roots twisting across the ground, making every step cautious. I moved slowly, wanting to take in everything. The sunlight filtering through the leaves painted patterns on the forest floor, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. There was something about being completely alone in such a vast, silent place that made my senses sharpen. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me look around. It was peaceful, but it also kept me alert. By the time I had been hiking for about 4 hours, I knew I needed to find a spot for the night. I wanted somewhere flat, with enough space for my tent, and ideally a bit sheltered from the wind. I came across a small clearing just off the trail. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and there were a few small boulders I could use as seating or to block the tent from wind. Beyond the clearing, the forest was thick, almost impenetrable, but I didn't mind. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure and the rainfly was tight. I unpacked my stove, boiled water, and cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The smell of the food made me feel better. It reminded me of home, even in the middle of the wilderness. As the sun fully set, darkness fell fast. The forest transformed. Shapes that were comforting in daylight now seemed threatening. I could hear the distant sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably deer or some other wildlife. But when I listened carefully, the noise seemed closer than it should have been, almost deliberate. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I went inside my tent and tried to sleep, but every crack, every rustle made me tense. My flashlight sat on the small tarp I had laid out in front of me, and I kept it within reach. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my heart stop. Something heavy was pressing against the tent. The nylon walls stretched under the pressure. My first thought was an animal, probably a bear since this area was known for them, but I had hung my food up in a tree, and there was nothing to attract it. I froze, listening. The pressure remained for a few moments, then whatever it was walked away. I waited another long moment before cautiously unzipping the tent just a crack to look outside. Nothing. No movement. No eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. The forest was silent again, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I tried to calm myself. Bears, raccoons, deer, any number of things could have caused that. Still, the fear lingered. I lay awake for hours, straining to hear anything out of place. Around 3 a.m., the sound returned, but this time it was footsteps on the ground near the edge of the clearing. Slow, deliberate steps, not the random scurrying of animals. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever was out there seemed to be circling the tent. I stayed perfectly still, clutching my knife and flashlight. The steps moved closer. I could hear breathing now, shallow and careful, as if someone was trying to avoid making too much noise. My mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to encounter people in this part of the forest. It was too remote. The realization hit me. Someone had found me, and they weren't just passing through. I spent the rest of the night awake, holding the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. Every snap of a branch made me jump. I didn't sleep. Dawn felt like it would never come, but eventually, the sky lightened. Even then, the forest felt heavy, watching. I slowly unzipped the tent to peek outside. The clearing looked empty, but there were footprints in the soft soil around my tent. They were human footprints, large, deep, and circling. My heart sank. I quickly packed my things, making sure not to leave anything behind, and I decided to leave immediately. I needed to get out of there before whoever had been circling came back. I followed the trail as quickly as I could, my pack bouncing against my back. Every sound made me tense, Birds flapping, branches cracking under my feet, distant rocks tumbling down slopes. I kept my flashlight ready, even though the morning light had returned. The footprints didn't seem to follow me exactly, but I couldn't be sure. Every turn I took, I imagined someone stepping out behind me. My pace increased. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. The trail twisted through dense undergrowth, across small streams, and over fallen logs. I kept the map and compass in my hands, checking my direction constantly. Getting lost here would be fatal. Hours passed. The trail led down toward a river I had seen marked on the map. I knew that if I could reach the river, I could follow it downstream to the main road. My fear kept me moving faster than I would have normally. By mid-morning, I reached the river. The water was icy and fast. I followed the bank, stepping carefully over rocks and through patches of mud. The trees started thinning as I got closer to the lower elevation. My legs were sore, my back ached, and my heart was still pounding from fear and exhaustion. But I kept going, couldn't stop. I had no way to call for help yet, but I knew that the main road was not far from here. Around early afternoon, I finally saw a car passing on the main road. I ran toward it, waving my arms and shouting. The driver slowed and stopped. Relief crashed over me in waves. I was shaking so badly I could barely speak, but I managed to explain where I had been and what had happened. They called the authorities for me. When the forest ranger arrived, they took note of the footprints and tracks around my campsite. Apparently, this area had seen a few incidents in the past. Criminals using remote trails to hide or stalk hikers, but there were very few reports, so it wasn't widely known. I realized how lucky I had been. The ranger warned me that anyone could have been hiding in the forest, and I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous encounter. I finally made it home safely. The trip left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched for weeks afterward. But I also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I had survived an intense, terrifying situation entirely on my own. I realized that planning, preparation, and staying calm under pressure had saved me. I also learned that even in the most beautiful, peaceful places, danger can exist. The forest had been breathtaking, but it had also been brutally honest in its threat. I could never see camping the same way again. Every hike I take now, I prepare even more, checking multiple sources, informing friends, and staying alert at all times. The fear I felt that night never fully leaves me, but it has taught me respect for the wilderness, and respect for the fact that humans can sometimes be more dangerous than any animal in the forest. Looking back, I also understood how important it was not to panic. Staying calm, observing everything carefully, and taking deliberate steps were what allowed me to get out of the forest safely. The terror I felt didn't cloud my judgment. It sharpened it. The forest remained wild and silent around me, beautiful and threatening in equal measure, and I left with an understanding that survival depends not on bravery alone, but on careful thought, preparedness, and the will to keep moving, no matter how afraid you are. The experience stayed with me for a long time. Every time I see a trailhead or hear a forest at night, my mind drifts back to that night, that clearing, and those footsteps circling my tent. But I survived, and that clarity, the awareness that comes from facing real danger, is something I carry with me every day. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. My work had been relentless, every day blending into the next with endless meetings, emails, and obligations. I needed a break, a real escape into nature, far from people, noise, and the tiny suffocating apartment I had been living in. I chose a forest area several hours away from the city, one that was known for its isolation and scenic beauty. The idea was simple: hike in, find a quiet clearing, set up my tent, and spend a few days alone, reading, walking, and sleeping under the stars. I had packed carefully, checking and rechecking my gear: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, water filter, extra food, and a first aid kit. I even brought my old compass and map, something I rarely needed in the modern world but insisted on carrying. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through small towns and stretches of open farmland before the roads narrowed and trees began to crowd in from both sides. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low but not yet threatening to vanish. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and took the first steps onto the trail. The forest was immediately dense, the smell of pine and damp earth filling the air. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the occasional rustle of small animals breaking through leaves reminded me I was not alone. I moved at a steady pace, careful not to strain my knees or ankles. The trail was narrow and uneven, roots jutting up from the soil like hidden obstacles, and I stepped cautiously, knowing one wrong move could turn into an injury hours from help. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridges of the forest, I had hiked for several miles. I had a rough idea of where I wanted to set up camp, a small clearing near a stream that appeared on my map. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and leaves, muffling my footsteps. I spotted the clearing as the light faded, the stream glinting faintly as it curved gently through the trees. It was perfect. I dropped my pack, setting the tent up near the edge where I could hear the water but still be shielded by a few large trees. The air was already cooling, and the thought of a fire made me shiver with relief. I gathered dry sticks and kindling, careful to avoid disturbing the surrounding undergrowth too much. Once the fire was lit, I sat close to it, the flames dancing and casting long shadows across the clearing. The first night passed without incident. The forest was alive with sound, animals moving in the underbrush, the wind rustling through branches. I slept fitfully, waking at times to the snapping of twigs, but nothing seemed close enough to concern me. Morning brought a soft light, filtered through leaves, and I felt a brief rush of peace. I drank water from my filtered supply, ate a simple breakfast, and planned my day. A long hike upstream along the stream, exploring some of the smaller trails that branched off the main path. As I moved deeper into the forest, the light changed, shadows lengthening and thickening under the dense canopy. I noted the signs of wildlife, tracks, broken branches, and occasional scat, but I was confident in my awareness and my ability to navigate. It was on the second day that I began to feel a faint sense of unease, a creeping awareness that the forest was more silent than it should have been in certain areas. The normal forest sounds, the constant background chatter of birds, squirrels, and insects, would suddenly drop to an almost unnatural stillness. It was subtle, but I noticed it. I chalked it up to my imagination, or perhaps just being more attuned to the forest after spending a night in it. That night, the temperature dropped more sharply than I expected. I huddled closer to the fire, wrapping my sleeping bag around me like armor against the cold. It was then I heard the first unmistakable sound. Heavy, deliberate footsteps outside my small clearing. At first, I froze, straining to listen, the flames in my fire flickering in my peripheral vision. The steps were slow, measured, and unlike the quick scurrying of animals I was accustomed to hearing. My heart rate spiked, and I reached for the flashlight, keeping it close. I waited, trying to rationalize. It could be another camper, a hiker passing through, or even a ranger. But the sound stopped abruptly, as if the person or animal realized I was awake. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps themselves. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire carefully maintained, eyes scanning the tree line. Dawn eventually came, bringing with it a fragile sense of relief. I packed my things, deciding to move deeper into the forest, away from the clearing, hoping to find another spot that felt safer. As I hiked, I noticed other signs, more footsteps, faint, larger than human in some cases, that seemed to crisscross the trails and intersect with mine. Each time I heard something moving off trail, I would freeze, breath shallow, scanning for any sign of another person or animal. My mind raced through possibilities. A hunter, lost hikers, or something worse. But the area was known to be sparsely visited, especially this deep into the forest. By the third day, my food supply was low, and my anxiety had built steadily. I decided to hike back to my original clearing, reasoning that it was at least familiar and I had a small stockpile of food there. As I retraced my steps, I noticed more subtle changes in the forest. Broken branches at unusual heights, tufts of fur caught in low-hanging branches, and scuff marks in the dirt that suggested larger animals or human movement. Every shadow seemed heavier, every rustle louder. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of movement at the edges of my vision. When I returned to my original clearing, I found the tent had been disturbed. The flap was partially open, stakes pulled loose, and my small pile of firewood was scattered. My stomach dropped. Nothing was missing, which suggested whoever or whatever had been there had only been investigating, perhaps curious, perhaps testing me. I spent the day rebuilding the tent, gathering new firewood, and trying to rationalize what had happened. The forest, once peaceful, now felt alive in an entirely different way. Intense, watching, almost deliberate. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, this time circling my clearing, slow and methodical. I didn't move, barely breathing, keeping the flashlight on the tent flap, watching. Hours passed, the footsteps continuing, stopping and starting, moving around the perimeter of my little camp. I could feel every nerve in my body screaming at me. The cold didn't bother me anymore. The fire felt like the only thin line between me and whatever was outside. At some point in the early morning, the footsteps stopped. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep in bursts, waking at intervals to ensure nothing had come closer. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I didn't wait. I packed everything, leaving the tent behind, and began the long hike back to the trailhead. My pace was faster than I had ever moved through the forest, adrenaline pushing me forward. Every crack of a branch under my boots, every gust of wind, made me tense. I didn't take breaks, didn't stop to admire the scenery, didn't check my map except to ensure I was still on the main trail. Hours later, I finally reached my car, collapsing into the driver's seat with trembling hands. The keys were barely steady in my grip. I started the engine, the sound startling in its normalcy after days in the forest. The drive out was quiet, the city slowly creeping back into view, bringing with it the artificial hum of life I had taken for granted. I didn't stop until I was home, locking the door behind me and sitting in the safety of my apartment for hours, staring at the walls, replaying every sound, every shadow, every feeling from the past days. I never went back to that forest. I sold the tent and gave away most of my camping gear. I realized that no amount of preparation, knowledge, or skill could have fully protected me from the unpredictable reality of being alone in a remote place. The forest was alive, but not in the way I had imagined it. It had rules I didn't understand and dangers I could not anticipate. I still think about it sometimes, the way the forest watched me, the way it could make a person feel so small and alone. But I also remember the relief of returning to civilization, the tangible safety of walls and locks, the quiet certainty that some places are better admired from a distance. The experience changed how I viewed the outdoors, how I respected isolation, and how I understood that survival is not just about physical preparation but also mental vigilance and respect for the unknown limits of nature. That trip, terrifying as it was, gave me a clarity I would not have gained otherwise. I learned to appreciate safety, to value companionship, and to recognize that even in nature's beauty, there is a raw, indifferent force that demands caution, awareness, and humility. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, escape the noise, and be alone in the wilderness for a few days. I had chosen a spot that was far from any established campgrounds, something off the beaten path, deep in a national forest I had never explored before. I packed carefully, making sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, plenty of food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small knife. I had also brought a map and compass, though I doubted I would need them. I had hiked before, and I was confident in my navigation skills. The drive to the forest took several hours. I passed through small towns that seemed to shrink in size and population the further I drove, the asphalt road giving way to dirt, and finally a narrow path surrounded by thick trees. I could feel my heart rate increase with anticipation. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the air itself is listening. When I finally found a small clearing by a river, I parked my car, unloaded my gear, and started to set up camp. The ground was uneven, covered with roots and rocks, but I found a spot that seemed suitable for my tent. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The ground was harder in some places than I had anticipated, and my hands grew sore from hammering the stakes. By the time the tent was finally up, the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air had grown cooler, and a thin fog was starting to rise from the river. I made a small fire pit, cleared some dry leaves and twigs, and began gathering wood. The smell of wet earth and pine filled my senses, and I felt a strange mix of calm and tension. I had read too many stories about people getting lost in the woods or encountering wildlife unexpectedly. And now, being alone, I was acutely aware of every sound. Night fell quickly. The fire was small but warm, and I ate a simple meal from the canned food I had packed. As darkness spread through the forest, I noticed how strange it felt to be completely alone. The usual distant hum of cars, planes, or human activity was gone. In its place was the sound of the forest at night, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the low croak of frogs, and the occasional splash in the river. At first, it was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But as the night deepened, those sounds began to feel different. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the undergrowth seemed sharper, closer, like something was moving intentionally. I decided to check my surroundings. I walked slowly around the clearing with my flashlight, scanning for any signs of wildlife or other people. I saw the glowing eyes of a raccoon reflected in my light, and a deer that startled and bolted into the darkness. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. The sounds didn't match the movements I could see. There was something in the distance, too far to make out clearly, but the noises were deliberate, steady, almost like someone was walking parallel to me, keeping pace without showing themselves. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but the unease stuck with me. I returned to my tent, feeling the tension in my shoulders. I tried to focus on starting a bigger fire, something that would keep me warm and give me a sense of security. As I worked, I thought about what I would do if something went wrong. If I got hurt, if I encountered an aggressive animal, or if someone else was out here in the dark. My phone had spotty service, almost non-existent, which made the isolation real. I finished setting up the fire, made sure my knife and flashlight were close by, and crawled into my sleeping bag, telling myself I just needed to sleep and the daylight would bring clarity. Sleep came in short bursts. Every noise, every shadow woke me. The wind through the trees sounded like someone whispering. At one point, I swore I heard a crunching of leaves right outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear anything else. After a few minutes, it stopped, and I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon again. I tried to focus on my breathing, but it didn't help much. My mind kept replaying the thought of someone else being out here, watching me. Around midnight, the noises grew more distinct. It wasn't just random animals anymore. It was deliberate, footsteps around the clearing, moving slowly, circling. I could hear branches snapping in a pattern, almost like someone testing the terrain, keeping their distance but ensuring I noticed them. My heart raced, and I knew I had to act cautiously. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it outside the tent, sweeping the area, but the darkness was deep, and the forest was full of shadows. I could see nothing, but I could still hear the movement. For what felt like hours, I stayed in the tent, flashlight ready, listening. The sound moved away and returned, circling, pausing, and circling again. I couldn't see anyone, but the presence was unmistakable. I realized that I had left my car unlocked, my gear outside, and if there was someone here, they could be watching or waiting. I thought about hiding or making noise, but any sudden move could provoke an unwanted response. The safest option seemed to be staying put and waiting for first light. Morning came slowly. The sun rose in streaks through the trees, casting long beams of light over the clearing. The footsteps had stopped during the night, but I didn't feel completely safe. I packed my gear quickly, keeping my knife in hand, and prepared to leave. As I walked toward my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Several footprints, much larger than mine, surrounding my tent. They weren't just walking through, they were deliberate, circling the tent, some closer than others. The prints were fresh, soft from the damp ground, and they headed toward the river before vanishing into the trees. I felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. Whoever had been here had left, but I was shaken. I loaded my gear into the car quickly and locked the doors. I drove out of the forest without stopping, the adrenaline keeping me alert. The whole way, I replayed the night over and over, trying to make sense of it. No animals make footsteps like that in such a deliberate pattern, and the size of the prints suggested a human. The thought that someone could have been watching me the entire night, hiding, waiting, made me realize just how vulnerable I had been. When I got home, I reported the footprints to the local ranger station. They listened, took notes, and confirmed that people sometimes trespassed into the forest, hunting or camping illegally. They said it was rare for anyone to approach campers, but it did happen. The idea that I had been alone with someone watching me, and that I might have encountered a potentially dangerous person, stayed with me for weeks. I didn't go camping again for a long time. When I did, I chose well-populated campgrounds, always within sight of others, always with reliable communication. But the memory of that night never left me. The cold, deliberate footsteps in the dark, the circling prints around my tent, the sense of being watched and helpless. I understood, in a very real and terrifying way, how isolated and vulnerable a person can become in the wilderness. Over time, I learned to prepare better, to trust my instincts, and to respect the danger of being alone in the forest. I never ignored a noise, never assumed it was just an animal, and I always made sure my surroundings were secure. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving, and I carry the lesson of that night with me. Survival is not just about knowing how to hike or set up a tent. It is about awareness, caution, and respecting the unknown that exists in every shadow. Even now, years later, when I hear stories of campers going into remote areas, I remember the cold fog of that morning, the footprints around my tent, and the weight of the silence at night. The forest does not forgive carelessness, and there are always risks beyond the obvious. The clarity of that night, the realization that someone had been close enough to harm me, yet careful enough to stay hidden, remains one of the most vivid, terrifying experiences of my life. It changed how I approach the wilderness forever, and the fear I felt that night is something I carry quietly as a reminder that nature is not always the only danger out there. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted to get as far away from the noise and stress of the city as possible, to be alone with nature, to test myself. I had mapped out a trail in a remote part of the forest that I had never been to before. It was far from the roads, far from any towns, and according to the few hikers' reports I could find, it wasn't heavily trafficked. I packed my backpack with all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 3 days, extra water, first aid kit, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, and my camera. I wanted to document the trip, maybe even take a few pictures of wildlife if I was lucky. I left early in the morning, driving until the paved road ended and the gravel path began, and then parking the car at the trailhead. The trail itself started gently, through thick pines and hardwoods, with a soft carpet of needles underfoot. I had my boots laced tight, my backpack snug, and I felt a rush of excitement. The first few miles were easy, the forest quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I kept my pace steady, enjoying the rhythm of my breathing and the crunch of twigs beneath my boots. By late afternoon, I reached the first clearing I had planned to camp at. A small flat area with soft grass and a few scattered rocks, and a tiny stream running nearby. I decided this would be a good spot to set up camp for the night. I laid out my tent, hammered the stakes into the ground, and set up my sleeping area inside. I started a small fire a safe distance from the tent and cooked a simple meal of pasta and canned vegetables. I watched the sunlight fade through the trees, shadows stretching across the clearing, feeling that mix of solitude and exhilaration that comes from being completely alone in the wilderness. After dinner, I cleaned up, put all the food in a bear-proof container, and secured it a little away from the tent. I didn't hear or see any large animals, But I knew that in areas like this, anything could be nearby. I felt a twinge of caution, but it was more exciting than frightening. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and stared at the dark ceiling of my tent, listening to the soft rush of the stream. The wind rustled through the trees, and every now and then I heard the distant call of an animal. I tried to sleep, but every small noise made me tense. I kept imagining a shadow moving past the tent, but I knew it was probably just the wind. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to a snapping sound, like a branch breaking, close to the campsite. My heart jumped, and I froze trying to listen. The sound came again, more deliberate this time, crunching through the underbrush. I sat up slowly, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness outside my tent. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or another animal, but the sound was too heavy, too purposeful. My stomach tightened with fear. I thought about the stories I had read online about hikers getting attacked by humans or large predators in remote forests. I told myself to stay calm, to stay quiet, to observe. The noise stopped. I waited, breathing shallowly, every muscle tense. Then I heard it again, closer this time, moving around the edge of the clearing. I realized that whatever it was circling me. My first instinct was to grab my knife, but I reminded myself that I had my flashlight and that if it was an animal, making myself seem larger and more intimidating could help. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the clearing. For a moment I saw nothing, then movement. A figure crouched low, moving carefully between trees. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal at first, but something about the way it moved seemed calculated, almost deliberate. My chest tightened, and adrenaline surged. I backed into the tent, trying to remember the safety tips I had read for encounters with wildlife or strangers in the woods. I didn't want to scream or run blindly. I remembered reading that sudden movement could trigger a chase instinct in both humans and animals. The figure paused, just at the tree lean, and seemed to be watching. My mind raced. I had a small bear spray can in my pack, along with my flashlight and knife. I weighed my options. Stay in the tent and hope it leaves, or make a run for the car in the dark, risking a confrontation. I decided the tent was my safest option for now. I zipped it up completely, grabbed the bear spray, and tried to make as little noise as possible. Hours passed like that. Every snap, every rustle made my heart pound. The figure seemed to be moving around the clearing, always just out of reach of the flashlight, circling. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think clearly. I just sat there, tense and alert, clutching the bear spray, listening to the forest breathe. Finally, just before dawn, the forest seemed to go quiet. The snapping and rustling stopped. I stayed still, waiting for the light to break through the trees. When the first pale light hit the clearing, I unzipped the tent slightly and peeked outside. Nothing. No figure, no footprints, no evidence that anyone or anything had been there. Only the forest, calm and quiet, as if nothing had happened. My relief was intense, but I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed up quickly, trying to be as quiet as possible. My hands were trembling, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement. I decided to hike back the way I came, keeping my pace steady but alert. The forest seemed different in the morning light. Still beautiful, still peaceful, but now carrying a sense of tension, a memory of the night. As I walked, I noticed small details I had ignored on the way in. Broken branches along the trail, footprints that didn't belong to any animal I knew, a piece of cloth snagged on a bush. My mind replayed the night, trying to make sense of it. I realized that whatever had been out there, it had been observing, waiting, calculating. And somehow I had survived because I had stayed calm, kept quiet, and paid attention to every sound. By late morning, I reached my car. I locked the doors, took a deep breath, and sat there for a while, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. I knew I would never forget that night. I also knew I would never go camping alone in that area again. I drove home slowly, every rustle of the car on the gravel making me tense again, every shadow in the trees reminding me of what had happened. Once I got home, I unpacked my gear, checking everything, and realized I had left behind a small scratch on the tent from the night. I couldn't see the cause clearly, but it was a reminder that the night had been real. I spent the rest of the day processing, writing down every detail I remembered, every sound, every movement. I knew that the experience had taught me something about caution, awareness, and respect for the wilderness. In the weeks after, I kept thinking about what had happened. Friends told me it might have been an animal. Others suggested someone could have been watching the trail. Couldn't be sure, but I knew that my survival had depended on staying calm, observing, and making careful decisions. It was a harsh lesson, but it was real, and it had ended with me alive and aware, carrying a new respect for the quiet dangers of the wilderness. The forest was beautiful, but it had a way of reminding me that beauty and danger often exist side by side. I never underestimated the importance of preparation, of being aware, or of trusting my instincts again. And I knew, no matter how much I loved the outdoors, some places were best left alone when alone. The memory stayed with me, a constant, vivid reminder of the night I learned that being careful and alert could make the difference between life and death. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted a real escape from everything: city noise, people, obligations. I needed to be alone, to test myself against the rawness of the wilderness. The idea was simple: a 3-day solo camping trip in a remote section of the forest, somewhere far enough from roads that no one would stumble across me by accident. I had done some research, marked trails on my maps, read survival tips, and packed meticulously. I thought I was prepared, but nothing could have prepared me for what came. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding along back roads that felt older than the country itself, narrow and worn, flanked by thick woods on either side. My car rattled over the uneven surface, tires crunching over stones and fallen branches. I remember that feeling of being on the edge of something unknown, the city and its lights shrinking behind me, replaced by tall, dense trees that blocked the sky. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt, as though the forest itself was watching. It was quiet, too quiet. Only the occasional crow's caw broke the stillness, sharp and unsettling. Finally, I parked at a small clearing that seemed almost made for my car, though it was clear no one used it often. There was no path beyond the clearing, just forest stretching endlessly in all directions. I grabbed my pack, heavier than I expected, with supplies, water, a tent, and emergency gear. I checked my map one last time, making sure I knew where I intended to set camp, somewhere deep enough to be truly isolated but near a small creek for water. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the forest floor. I started walking, feeling the uneven ground under my boots, roots twisting up like hidden obstacles, branches brushing against my arms. The forest smelled alive, earthy, wet, with a faint tang of decay. Birds and insects stirred in the fading light. I kept my pace steady, my senses alert. Every rustle in the underbrush made my heart jump. I told myself it was just small animals, deer maybe, or squirrels, but a creeping sense of unease was already settling in my chest. I tried to push it down, focus on the task, find my camp before it got dark. Hours passed as I wound through the trees. The light was disappearing faster than I expected. By the time I found a suitable clearing near the creek, the sky was already an inky purple, and the forest around me had begun to change. Shadows deepened, shapes of trees blending together. The quiet had changed too, not peaceful anymore, but tense, like the forest was holding its breath. I set up my tent quickly, my hands trembling slightly, partly from nerves, partly from fatigue. After securing my shelter, I gathered firewood, trying to keep my mind busy. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching under my boots seemed deafening in the oppressive quiet. As I started my fire, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly. It was early fall, but the chill felt sharper than I expected. My fingers went numb as I struck the matches, finally coaxing a small flame into life. The fire crackled, a tiny beacon in the darkness. I felt relief, a sense of control returning. I cooked my simple dinner, canned beans and rice heated over the fire, and ate slowly, listening to the forest. At first, I heard only normal night sounds: owls, the rustle of leaves, the distant croak of frogs. But as the minutes stretched, a different sound emerged, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A crunching in the underbrush, close by, but not on the trail I had taken. I froze, listening intently. The sound was deliberate, slow, and steady, like someone or something was moving carefully toward me. I tried to reason with myself. It had to be a deer, a raccoon, or another small animal. But then I heard a low snap, louder, sharper. It wasn't random. Something was following me. My mind raced. I had brought a small hatchet for protection, but I hadn't expected to use it tonight. The fire offered some comfort, but the forest beyond it seemed to lean closer, as though pressing in on me. I kept my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flames, trying to catch a movement. The sound stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever was there had paused. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing came. I tried to sleep that night, curling into my sleeping bag. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my pulse spike. I knew I was far enough from the road that no one would hear me if something happened. Sleep was impossible. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it clearly, heavy breathing from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I sat up slowly, trying to see, and caught a shadow moving, watching me from the trees. It was human-shaped, crouched low, staying in cover. My heart slammed against my ribs. I couldn't see its face. I didn't know if it was a person or multiple people. My pack was just behind me with all my supplies, but I couldn't reach it without leaving the relative safety of the fire. My mind raced. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal, not a single bar. The thought of trying to run through the forest at night, in the cold, with no light, terrified me. The shadow shifted, moving closer to the edge of the firelight. I felt trapped. I remembered every article I had read about being lost or confronted in the wild. Stay calm, stay visible, make noise, don't run blindly. I grabbed a flashlight, switching it on, pointing it directly at the shadow. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a man. He was gaunt, dressed in layers that looked scavenged, his eyes wild. He froze when he saw me. I could see that he was unarmed, but the way he stared, and the way his movements were careful and deliberate, made me know he could still be dangerous. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I kept the flashlight on him, holding the hatchet close. He made a small, slow step back, then turned and melted into the darkness. My body shook with adrenaline. I waited, unsure if he would return, until dawn lightened the sky just enough for me to breathe more freely. The next day, I packed up cautiously, scanning the woods for any sign of him. I decided not to stay another night. I had my trail, I had my car, but the forest didn't feel safe anymore. As I walked, I noticed tracks, recent, bare footprints in the damp soil, following my path. I quickened my pace but stayed alert. The forest felt alive in a different way now. Not peaceful, but unpredictable and full of hidden danger. By late afternoon, I reached my car, exhausted and tense. The keys trembled in my hand as I unlocked it. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and sat for a moment, letting the engine hum under me. I watched the forest, every tree, every shadow, and I felt a deep respect for it. It was beautiful, alive, and mercilessly indifferent to human concerns. I realized how unprepared I had been, not for survival, but for the unexpected. Even the simplest planning couldn't account for encountering another human who might see you as a threat, a target, or just a curiosity. Driving back on the rough, winding roads, I thought about what had happened. The fear, the isolation, the awareness of being so small and exposed in a massive ancient forest. It stayed with me. But I also felt a profound relief. I had made it out. I had survived not because of luck alone, but because I stayed calm, assessed the situation, and moved carefully. That night, once home, I unpacked my gear, examining every piece of clothing, every tool. I made notes about what I would do differently if I ever went back. I knew I would not return soon, not until I had a better understanding of the risks, of the human element that no guidebook or article could truly prepare me for. The forest had tested me, and I had passed in my own way. I learned that camping, even in the most prepared circumstances, demanded vigilance, respect, and an understanding that danger wasn't always natural. Sometimes it came from other people, equally desperate and equally unpredictable. I never saw the man again. I never knew who he was or why he was there, but the experience changed me. I became more careful, more observant, and more attuned to the realities of wilderness survival. I carried the memory of that night like a scar, a reminder that being alone in the forest is not just a challenge of nature, but of circumstance, of human unpredictability, and of staying alive in the face of fear you can't fully explain. From that trip onward, I respected the wilderness in a way I never had before. I planned more thoroughly, left detailed itineraries, always carried backup communication, and always remembered that even in the most serene and beautiful places, there is the potential for danger. Sometimes quiet, sometimes terrifying, and sometimes human. That understanding became part of every adventure I took afterward, shaping the way I approached the outdoors forever.